How does Plato argue for the immortality of the soul? That's a question that comes up in the account of the last days of Socrates, in particular in a book called Phaedo, or I suppose you could pronounce it Phaedo. I'll pronounce it Phaedo for today. In Phaedo, you have this story of the last days of Socrates, where he is preparing to take the hemlock cup as a consequence of supposed crimes against the city. And in it, you have this sort of major theme that true philosophers, as Socrates says, make dying their profession. The story is kind of developed with some dramatic, I don't know, flair, but basically it recounts four arguments from Socrates on why the soul is immortal, as he's trying to convince his friends and presumably himself that when he takes the poison cup, that he will not perish forever, but have a sort of everlasting life after death. He gives four arguments for the immortality of the soul. He answers two objections to his arguments, and then ends with a myth on the afterlife before the story shows him sort of floating away into this sort of bodiless contemplation of eternal forms, this release of the soul from the body. To understand the Phaedo and its major theme, it's actually worth asking the question, why is it called Phaedo, before we get into the arguments. Phaedo is one of the narrators of the book, and it's kind of odd for a narrator for Plato to name one of his works after a narrator. So why is that? Well, Phaedo of Elis is an interesting character because his biography might actually explain the reason why Plato named the dialogue Phaedo. Phaedo was a man who was captured, enslaved, and put into service at a brothel as someone who had to serve the bodily pleasures and needs of other people. But he eventually gets connected to philosophical people, and through those connections he finds freedom from his servitude to the flesh, as it were. And you have here then a release from slavery, an emancipation from the lifelong pursuit of of an enslavement to the body, to be able to think and to reflect and to meditate on what is more truly real, what is more important in life. That seems to be the parallel, the theme of the Phaedo, where Socrates wants and looks forward to death, because at death he will be released from his body, which prevents him, at least in part, from a full experience of the pursuit of wisdom, truth, forms, and all this sort of thing. And part of this has to do, as the Phaedo opens and sort of implies and explains, we live there's a couple of reasons. One is, I'll get to this later, but the body kind of is heavy and prevents you from seeing these things. But the most straightforward reason why I think our life prevents us from seeking true philosophy is because we're stuck in this pleasure and pain cycle. And as Phaedo explains it kind of works like this. All of us will suffer one day. Let's say you have a wound on your leg, a cut, and then you put some salve on it, and there's a pleasure through putting salve on the wound. Or let's say you're hungry, that's a pain of hunger, and then you eat food, there's pleasure in eating food. And then the next day you're hungry again, or the next day you get another scrape on your leg. All sorts of pains and pleasures we experience with life, and yet they're sort of oscillate and circle around us. There's no end to it. Pain leads to pleasure, pleasure leads to pain. Even the pain of hunger or the pain of cold that needs to be released from heat, like a jacket or something. All of this aims to distract us, to bring us down to like the necessities of life, so that we really can't focus on the most important things. We are sort of doomed to an endless cycle of pain and pleasure, and to escape from that, to be released from that, is one of the goals. And Phaedo, as the person, maybe represents that through his biography. It's also important to know who the main characters are. Phaedo is, of course, the narrator, as I noted. He talks with a guy named Socrates, who's a Pythagorean. But the main characters whom Socrates interacts with are Simmias and Sabus, who are Pythagoreans from Thebes. And this is really important because when you look at the arguments in Plato's Phaedo, they are, in my opinion, and not just mine, I guess others, they are particularly tilted towards a Pythagorean way of life. So some of them may not feel intuitive just to a reader who doesn't have prior commitments to Pythagorean philosophy, physics, and so on, but they would have been more compelling to readers in that philosophical school. And also the arguments make sense when you think about how Pythagoreans thought. So for example, the first argument in Plato's Phaedo, the edition that I'm looking at, by the way, is just this Penguin edition. There's lots of editions out there. I'll mention some book references, but I'll use the common references, not the page numbers. And then you can, in whatever edition you're looking at, see those references. But basically, the first argument for the soul's immortality, or perhaps the soul's release from the body, in ongoing philosophical pursuits, is an argument from opposites. And if you read it, it almost doesn't make full sense. I mean, it goes something like this. If you're alive, it makes sense that you'll eventually die, so the state of death comes from the state of life. And as you understand the wholeness of life, there's all these kind of these states from X to Y, Y to Z, and they're always seemingly opposites. And so it strikes then Plato, or Socrates, who Plato's the author of in this case, it strikes Socrates that the argument from opposites can be compelling because if a state of life, or if state of death comes from a state of life, then actually a state of life comes from a state of death. What does that mean? Well, it means that the souls who are in a state of death become embodied, we would say, and create a state of life in the body. And there's a sense in which the soul then pre-exists the body, which isn't a full argument, but it's at least gesturing towards conclusions that Plato will draw, namely on the pre-existence of the soul and the ongoing existence of the soul after the dissipation of the body. Largely, though, this is an insider argument because he's talking to Pythagoreans who have a view of the world as being set in pairs of opposites. It's a sort of physics argument, I guess. What comes up must come down, all that kind of stuff. Infinity, infinitude, all this. And so Plato's using the physics that were accepted by his interlocutors, and he is kind of pressing into that to show, wow, it seems actually logical and fitting. So if you look at 72D, he'll conclude his argument by saying, yes, Sabus, he said, if anything is true, I believe that this is, and we were not mistaken in our agreement upon it. Coming to life again is a fact, and it is a fact that the living come from the dead, and a fact that the souls of the dead exist. Again, you read that, it's logical, but it's not necessarily persuasive unless you have this sort of view of the physical world in which is comprised of opposites and equitable numerical precision. But it makes sense within the story of the Phaedo, because remember, Plato is writing a story. There's tension that we'll come to, especially as Plato delivers three arguments, not only the argument from opposites, but recollection and affinity. And then these two counter-arguments come, and there's an interlude, and there's a bit of a panic, like, oh no, the soul is not immortal, what's going to happen? Well, that's okay, because the fourth argument of Socrates comes, and the fourth argument of Socrates, from the mind of Plato, is an argument based on forms, which seems to be really what he wants to get to throughout. But first he has to establish some parameters for how to think about the soul and the body as irreducibly united in life, but not always united in all categories of what we might call life. The second argument for the immortality of the soul, after the argument of opposites that really is meant for Pythagorean philosophers, but sort of makes sense to us, is the argument from recollection. This is an argument that Plato has already made in the Meno, but it goes something like this. Learning, at least learning of a certain kind, is more like remembering. And this is true when you think about universal concepts like oddness, evenness, and justice. Something about these concepts are intuitive. If you split a donut with two toddlers, one will know that one's bigger than the other and be mad about it. If you look at two equal sized pencils, you will say they have a similitude, a likeness, maybe they represent equality. The reason you can make that comparison in front of you is because you already know of a concept like equalness or unsimilarity or similarity or whatever. There's these sort of universal things we all just sort of intuitively know. I think in the Meno, I can't remember exactly how it's made, but it has to do with geometry. I think Plato talks to a slave and he shows him shapes, and the slave, who has not been educated in the schools, can easily discern and describe equality of length and all that kind of stuff. If memory serves, I have to look at it again, but it's something like that anyways. And the idea here is that this uneducated person is intuiting, knowing, almost spontaneously something like he's remembering something he already knew. And so this is why in 73a of the Phaedo, Socrates, Plato, let's just say Plato because Plato's the author, Plato will say learning is really just recollection. And so when we learn something more like universal, we really just remember something we knew already. Today we would call this intuition, but it just came to us. When you look at a beautiful sunset, you see beauty by beauty. You are able to just have this sort of explosion of, this is beautiful. It's not that you had to learn it from a book. It's already there, locked into your soul. And this is because Plato says your soul pre-existed your body. You used to know these things when you were in a state where you could contemplate the forms of triangularity, equalness, oddness, justice, truth, etc. You already knew that. And this is because on Earth, this is important. It's going to hint at his form argument. When you see pictures of like a horse, you know that it represents like a drawing of a horse or a real horse. There's a similarity, not a perfect similarity, but there's a sign that points to the thing signified, to borrow later language found in Augustine. And likewise, on Earth, when we see things like equalness, oddness, whatever, these may be imperfect. If you go with a microscope, you look at them, there might be some imperfections. But that's fine. Just like the picture of a horse that a toddler draws, and you know that it's an imperfect copy of the real thing. So on Earth, when you see triangles, equalness, oddness, whatever it is, you know that it's an imperfect copy of the real thing, that form, that unchanging thing of justice or equalness or whatever it is. And so you can come to know those things, even if they're imperfect on Earth. This is going to hint and gesture at something's going to get into the next two arguments, namely the argument of forms, that are there the way that you essentially know anything, the way that you are, is through the idea that there are unchanging forms of the things that you see on Earth, and you recognize things on Earth because you know the forms mentally or soulishly, we might say. So Plato concludes, which I guess will be the character Socrates concludes, our present argument applies no more to equality itself than it does to beauty itself, or goodness, justice, holiness, all those qualities. I maintain, which we designate in our question and answer discussions by the term itself. So we would have to obtain knowledge of all these things before our birth. That's 74c. What he's trying to say is, we know beauty itself, goodness itself, justice itself, holiness itself. We know justice by holiness. By beauty, we know beauty. What he's getting at is there's some unchanging reality that somehow we access, he'll get into that a little bit later, through soul, and we can know the imperfect copies of those things on Earth. It's partly a theory of knowing, partly a metaphysical description of the world, partly an ontological definition of what justice is, and so on. Since for Plato to know something, you have to know what it is. Um, Within the sort of Christian tradition, you have a similar idea. So the Apostle Paul, who is kind of known to at least have recognizable ideas that parallel Stoicism, and at the time that he was alive, it's sort of Platonic Stoicism. He talks in Romans chapter 1, for example, that pagans, those who don't know the scriptures, can and do know God's righteous decree. And even though they know God's righteous decree, as Romans 1:32 says, they actually don't follow the right, justice in this case. They don't follow justice. They instead celebrate injustice, although they know it. Everyone kind of knows it. A little bit earlier in chapter 1, Paul talks about how people actually even know God. They can know him, and that's the reason why they're accountable for not following him. Paul says they are without excuse, and they're without excuse precisely because, as Romans 1:21 says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. The idea is they're without excuse because, as the prior verses say, God's, a sort of eternal power and creative ability was known precisely through the things that are made. Created objects testify to the invisible power of God. So visible objects, as Paul says, testify to the invisible truths about God, and as a consequence, they are without excuse. If this were not the case, that they could not know God, and as 132 of Romans will say, his righteous decree, they would have an excuse. But because not only knowledge of God, but knowledge of his of justice or righteousness is knowable by all people, then when you don't follow these things, you're without excuse. Romans chapter 2 and verses 14 and 15 will provide another way of thinking about this, namely that the law of God is written upon the hearts of the inner person of all people. Later, reformational thinkers will talk about this as the light of reason. Well, not just reformational, Augustine does too. It's not, but they'll use that language as well. And in particular, many people will go to John 1:9, which says the Logos, the Logos of God, the reason of God, Christ himself, illuminates every human being. But he can't illuminate them savingly because people reject the darkness, or the light, and choose darkness over the light, even as own and accept him. So what does this universal illumination mean? It must mean that there is some sort of universal knowledge of God the Creator and the way to live your life, the light of reason we might call it. However you want to parse this out, Plato seems to be recognizing something that religious traditions and philosophical traditions pick up on, and that there is some sort of intuitive knowledge, do no harm. Seems like everyone knows that do no harm is right, even if many people do harm frequently. You still know in your heart of hearts that it is wrong. It doesn't mean that you follow through with your principles. That's, in fact, Paul's precise argument, that while all people know the righteous commandment of God, decree of God, they don't do it, and they even cheer on people who don't do it. That's what makes them without excuse. Plato knew that as well, and he's trying to escape from that cycle. True philosophy knows what something is and aligns their life with the way things are. There's a sort of cosmic order to things, which I suppose in the Timaeus you could see. Now, again, just to repeat, the argument from recollection is we seem to know things intuitively, like justice, holiness, equalness, oddness, etc. It means we already knew it before we learned it. When did we know it? And his answer is before birth, because your soul knew it before you were a body. In this case, he believes in something like there's a pool of souls in the formal world, or in a place where they can gaze on the forms, but they get heavy and weighted down, and eventually take on the weightiness of the body, and the body is so heavy that it kind of beclouds our vision, and we begin to be forgetful of these things. And the pain and pleasure cycle of life, all the necessities of eating and drinking and sleeping's a release from the pain of tiredness, etc., distract us so much, and we're so limited by the body that we need to be released from it. The third argument is the argument from affinity. Now, Plato recognizes that his prior two arguments only can prove that the soul pre-exists the body, and of course imply that the soul and the body are not exactly the same thing. But as he says in 76c of the Phaedo, he needs to actually prove that the soul exists after death. One could think, that the soul simply dissipates after the body's death or something. But Plato avers that this can't be the case, since the soul is akin to, is like in nature to, eternal forms of justice, evenness, and so on. And so here we see a kind of logical ordering. So the opposites sort of give you this idea that there are stable qualities in subjects, like life, death, hot, cold, up, down, etc. The argument from recollection tell you, things that are universally true. There's these forms that are kind of implied throughout. And now we really get to, your soul is really like these forms, and these forms don't have a beginning or end. They're kind of eternal. They don't change. They're invisible and uncomposed of things. And so likely then your soul is very much like that, and therefore is indestructible as well. Basically here Plato, or Socrates, but Plato's the author, divides reality into two: visible things that are composite and invisible things that are simple. A visible thing that is composed of many elements, you can think of like fingernails, toes, hair, etc. When it dies, or mushrooms or whatever, it decomposes and falls into little pieces. That's because it's composite. It's composed of many elements: water and blood, bone and marrow, all that kind of stuff. It all kind of dissipates, falls apart. Well, the opposite can't be true. If you're just the most simplest element, like the most basic atom or the most basic neutron or whatever it is, you don't dissipate. You're the most simplest element. I don't know if that was correct. Biologically, someone can correct me on that. It just kind of came to mind as I was talking. Whatever the most simple thing is, it doesn't fall apart by necessity. And when it comes to something like justice or holiness or truth, it's got to be a simple thing that's not composed. And the reason why is because it's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Justice today is do no harm. And if justice tomorrow was do harm, then it wouldn't be justice. It would be arbitrary. It would be changing. There'd be no access to universal norms. Life would be the chaos of opinion one day to the next. Like you'd be like a ship tossed to and fro in a storm with no anchor, no safety. So justice is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's why people can discern, discover, and know what justice is. As Paul says, must be possible for people to have no excuse. And as Plato says, is intuitively necessary, because all of us know the base justice itself. Okay, so things that are visible fall apart. They decompose like a body. Things that are visible have a beginning and an end, like an ant's life, etc. And things that are not composed, like justice itself, seem to be ongoing. Things that are invisible, like justice is invisible to the five senses, right, or to the eyes in particular, that seems to be ongoing. And if the soul is something that's not visible to the eyes, that seems to be the persistent you that is always you, even if your hair changes and your nose grows and your ears get weird or whatever, you still remain you. And that you is sort of your soul, I guess you might say. It seems intuitive, it seems logical, it seems fitting to Plato to say that the soul is the invisible, incomposite, simple, I don't know if you'd use the word simple, but this idea, simple, basic element. And when you, maybe not element, simple object, and when you get there, you realize that the soul is very much like the forms themselves. In fact, later he'll identify the soul as kind of necessarily having life, the form of life. I'm not fully clear. Someone who's maybe a Plato expert can get to this, but we'll get this in the fourth argument. It feels to me that the soul for Plato is not quite a form, but it's not quite a regular subject either. It's almost some mediating thing that has the form of life in it, essentially, you might say, but not quite the form of life itself. It's kind of an interesting thing. We'll get there shortly. So because of this, Plato will explain the soul is most like that which is divine, immortal, intelligible. Intelligible meaning sort of invisible intelligence, not like smart per se. Uniform, indissoluble, and every self consistent and invariable. Ever self-consistent and invariable, whereas body is most like that which is human, mortal, multiform, unintelligible, indissoluble and never self-consistent. And then he knows shortly after, is it not natural for a body to disintegrate rapidly, but for the soul to be quite or very nearly indissoluble? So what he's getting at is that the soul is very much like these divine, immortal, intelligible, uniform, in unbreakdownable, incorruptible, invisible forms like justice. And because it's very much like it, and because that's how you'd actually know them through your mind or your soul, that it's more likely that the soul persists after death, while the body dissipates, while the body dissolves. The soul is indissoluble, you might say. At this point, it seems like we're about to come to this sort of climax, and everything will be happy. But Simmias and Cebes offer two objections to Plato at this point in the story. Simmias says, well, what if the soul is like an attunement? It's not an actual object. It's more like it's a name that we describe for how everything's put together. Your soul is just the combination of all the elements that make up your body. And Plato, and in this case, then when your body dies, the soul would technically die too. So it fit into a Pythagorean view of harmony, balance, music, a numerical way of viewing the life. Simmias will say the body is held together at a certain tension between the extremes of hot and cold and dry and wet and so on, and our soul is a balance or attunement of these same extremes when they are combined in just the right proportion. But once the instrument dies, how can the attunement survive? So soul dies when the physical constituents do. That's his argument. Cebes then presents another objection. Unlike Simmias, he believes the soul survives the body. He thinks the arguments are sufficient to say that. But he wonders why the soul needs to be immortal. Maybe it just weakens over time and eventually just kind of breaks down and dissipates. So it's longer lasting than the body, but it's not eternal. So Cebes grants that the soul pre-exists the body, and he affirms the arguments from opposites and recollection, the first two arguments for the immortality of the soul, but he cannot grant the argument from affinity as proof that the soul exists after death. He thinks, okay, well, maybe that it exists after death, but that it's just as immortal as justice. He can't accept that aspect of it. Now, that does not mean he doesn't grant the existence of the soul. He says the soul is a long-lived thing, whereas the body is a relatively feeble and short-lived thing, by implication. But Plato responds that since Simmias believes the soul pre-exists along the lines of the argument of recollection, then he's already believed the soul can exist apart from the body. So this would be the first argument, the one that's like an attunement. If he already believes the soul pre-exists, he can't really think the soul is just a mere attunement. So it's not really a great argument. Further, Plato adds that qualities inhere in the soul, and that would not make sense if it was a mere attunement. So qualities like justice and holiness and so on, they inhere in us. So if you do justice by knowing justice, by beauty you see beauty, and so on. These come and go as you access them. That's how kind of change works. That's how you move from loving one person to another. By love you love this person. By a lack of love you don't love this person. By love you love another person. By love you like pizza, etc. And that's the way that all works, so it doesn't really make sense as well. When he responds to Cebes, though, he needs to spend more time in response. So there he gives, I would say, a final argument, an argument that includes Plato's famous theory of forms. So here's the kind of argument. Plato says, look, I was exploring the physical world for years. I was trying to understand the ultimate answer, the reasons behind everything. I found Anaxagoras, and Anaxagoras said that intelligence was behind everything. That was really profound to me. He says this in 97c. But Anaxagoras, he really didn't follow his own principles. He didn't actually demonstrate how intelligence, or logos, or whatever, is behind all things. Eventually, Plato will discover things like forms and participations, and that paradigm will eventually begin to explain everything. A little bit later, he talks about, in a sort of hierarchy of formal causes or forms, you eventually have to get down to a single thing, an ikanon, what is necessary, a sort of single reason or explanation that makes sense of all the other forms, which in the Republic he calls the good, and which, according to Aristotle, he calls the one. I might have got that backwards. But anyways, those three terms to describe probably what we would say is God, but he obviously uses different language. So he begins to think through how the world works, how change works, what's behind everything. And for him, it begins to be absurd to talk about the world merely in just very physical ways. So if you say someone's a head taller and another person's a head shorter, you're saying someone's tall by the same thing as that someone's short. It almost doesn't make sense logically. It makes sense just in common speech. But when you begin to observe these things, you need to have a more exact, a more comprehensive way to talk about difference, change, coming into being, going out of being, and so on. And for Plato, that is, one partakes of tallness, one partakes of shortness, one partakes of beauty. By beauty, you know beauty. By courage, you act courageously, and so on. And when I say courage and beauty, I mean beauty itself, courage itself. There's some stable reality, objective, discoverable thing, object that your soul can participate in. And therefore, when we see you acting courageously, everyone around you can see your acts of courage and all participate by soul in the same concept of courage. And therefore, that's courage. So courage is not subjective. This is incredibly anti-skeptical. It's incredibly pro-truth, incredibly pro-knowledge, incredibly pro-objectivity. So Plato, though, does want to find a hypothesis, an explanation, and he eventually in 101D talks about this whole hierarchy of explanations or starting points, which he calls, find one that is necessary to explain all the others. In Republic 511b, he also speaks of hypotheses or explanations, and there he notes that reason or logos, through dialectics, i.e. through conversation, can discover hypotheses or explanations, so that reason rises to that which requires no assumption, and is the starting point of all, the pantos archein. Now, as a starting point of all, my brain immediately goes to, Aristotle's metaphysics, where he describes the pursuit of philosophy as sort of finding this first principle. And to me, I think that's what Plato's doing. I'm not a Plato expert, but that seems to be reasonable. For him, this thing that requires no assumption, no argument, this starting point of all, this explanation of all things, what is necessary behind it all in Phaedo, is the equivalent of the good, the one, God, whatever you want to say. Now, not the God of, not the gods of Hinduism or necessarily the God of the Bible, etc., but God in the sense that it's the one thing behind all things. Lloyd Gerson, who's studies Plato, he would be a bit more confident in saying that Plato's talking about what we would call God. Many Christians, someone like a Clement of Alexandria, would argue that Plato kind of knew the real God through this. Ulrich Zwingli, the reformer, believes that Plato is in heaven, for example. So there is a kind of a long tradition of people seeing Plato as obviously before Christ, and yet kind of like Melchizedek or Job, before the revelation of God in Christ, knowing through natural revelation and maybe through like supernatural communication as well, truths about God that are sufficient to know him. Now, I'm not going to comment on that, just note that it is true that that's a very normal thread throughout time. In any case, Plato here is going to make his sort of final argument for the immortality of the soul after these two objections come. And the final argument is essentially responding to the second objection. It's also dramatic because I didn't mention it, but between there's an interlude with Phaedo and Echecrates, and it's almost like, oh no, the soul's not immortal. Socrates will die, and he won't live on. It's so sad. And then finally Socrates comes with like this, this God in the machine type argument that really he's been implying the whole time. The argument from opposites was a setup to get the Pythagoreans to basically talk his talk. The argument for recollection is really gesturing towards the forms. It assumes they exist. The argument from affinity is like, well, your soul is like the form. Then the argument from what I'm calling the argument of forms, I think there's probably a different title for it historically, but the argument from forms at the end will eventually get to this idea that, opposites, like the state of life and the state of death, can't be beside each other, or come from each other. That's not the case when it comes to the particular qualities like truth and falseness. qualities like that, not the subjects or states, but qualities like that sort of make one retreat from the other. So fire, the quality of fire makes the quality of cold retreat, etc. And, Plato will assume that the soul is the life of the body. It seems intuitive to everyone. In the Hebrew tradition, you have this in Genesis 2:7, where God breathes life into the clay receptacle of a human being, and it gives that human being life, and it becomes a living spirit. So this is a pretty common view in the ancient world, one that probably most of us sort of intuit, that something gives life, something animates, gives life to our body. But he says if this is the case, then the quality that inheres in the soul is the form of life. And yes, when death inheres into the body, then by necessity the form of life in the soul retreats from the body. But that form of life, by definition, is undying, just like the form of life is. And so life and undying soul, but just by definition, can't accept or admit its opposite quality, or else definitionally it's like the law of non-contradiction. Like, you can't be dead and alive at the same time in the same way. So he makes this distinction, here. It's really interesting. He almost, and this is just interesting historically, makes a distinction very much akin to Aristotle's distinction of essence and accidents. So in 102e, basically, he says there's a persistent subject, and there's the qualities that inhere in the subject. The subject, in this case, would be the soul or the person, and the person has these inherent qualities that he partakes of. So justice, holiness, whatever, the knowledge of equalness and oddness, and he does that through partaking of these eternal forms that are out here, and then you can see the imitation of them in the world around us. This will be pretty important to think about how your soul is the persistent you. But he makes a large argument, as I noted earlier, how cold drives heat away, how heat drives cold away, and non-life drives life away, but not necessarily with destroying it. Just because heat drives cold away doesn't mean cold's gone. You can have a cold night and a hot day. Reasonably, when these opposite qualities come, one retreats because heat can't emit cold, cold can't emit heat. It drives the other one away. This is the same thing that's true with numbers like 3, 5, and 7. They are persistent subjects or numbers, and yet they have the inherent quality of oddness. The quality of equality can't coexist with them, or else 7 would have to be 8, which is an even number. You just have these, they just can't. One retreats when there are 8. When 8 comes, evenness enters into the number, and oddness retreats. And this begins to help you with the soul, because the soul is... this I have to double check exactly. It says is a bit. This is where I find a bit of a struggle. It seems like the soul is the form of life, or the soul necessarily has the form of life, which is that quality. And so, since the soul is the life to the body, it cannot exist with unlife, which is, we will call that death. That is, if the soul is life, it cannot exist with unlife. It is undying and cannot coexist with dying by definition, because it has the quality of life in it. Likewise, 3 contains oddness, and oddness cannot coexist with evenness. These opposite forms or qualities themselves enter and retreat from one another. And again, this doesn't contradict the arguments of opposites, because there Plato spoke of subjects who had qualities like life and death, but here he speaks of the qualities themselves. So if I was a person and I die, I enter into a state of death. But maybe my soul persists, then that's a state of death in Hades or whatever, or Tartarus, but I maybe can enter back into a state of life from the state of death, etc. But we're talking about the actual qualities like justice and holiness, etc. So he concludes, when death comes to a man, the moral part of him dies, but the undying part retires at the approach of death and escapes unharmed and indestructible. And a bit later he says, then it is certain as anything can be, Sabus, that soul is undying and imperishable, and that our souls will really exist in the next world. So, in essence, you might want to read this section for yourself. This is in 106e, which I just read. But Plato was saying the quality of the soul has the form of life, inhering in it, and I guess essentially it's there. It can't not be there, because the soul is the life of the body by definition. And just as opposite qualities can't admit the opposite. It's the law of non-contradiction. Fire doesn't emit cold, cold doesn't emit fire, etc. So life doesn't emit unlife, and therefore the soul doesn't emit mortality. Rather, it remains undying, etc. Now, this is not a sole argument. It actually relies on the prior three arguments to build a cumulative case. But all of this has to do with the soul's unique ability to commune with the forms, for knowledge to work. You know beauty by beauty. By beauty you know beauty, because your soul can partake of beauty itself, and therefore you can see reflections of beauty in the world. And just as the soul is the life of the body, it's life by life, therefore it can't admit of the opposite, and therefore it's undying, just like the forms are undying in the prior argument, etc. Now, you might not find that entirely compelling, but that's the argument as it goes. Again, the last argument for me, I still feel like I want to know a little better about the piece of the puzzle that I'm still curious about, is how the soul has life essentially, how it doesn't just inhere and can leave it, but it seems like Plato very strongly believes that the definition of the soul is the life. So that's something maybe I need to return to or read some commentaries on. I'm sure in the comments you probably can just connect the dots for me, because it could be just something obvious that I missed. But it still feels like there's just a missing piece there in my brain. It's logical, I get the argument. But there's a missing piece from how Plato gets there to there that I would just be curious to explore further. So in this way, Plato concludes his four arguments for the soul's immortality and release: the argument from opposites, the argument from recollection, the argument from affinity, and finally the argument from forms. All of these are aiming to show that the soul can be released from the body in order to reach the goal of philosophy, namely to know the forms immediately without having the body to kind of weigh you down, and the cycle of pain and pleasure to distract you, I suppose, from philosophical leisure. The rest of Phaedo is a myth of the afterlife, which is very interesting, but I'm not going to cover it here, and the death of Socrates, which is portrayed very symbolically, where his body slowly deadens and coldens, and eventually you see he just kind of flitters off into the afterlife as an immortal soul to pursue the goal of philosophy. And that is the end of Phaedo. And that is how Plato argues for the immortality of the soul. Let me know if this was interesting to you, and if it wasn't, okay, well, I guess I'll know that if you don't like this video. But I'd love to do a few more of these on writings that I've read enough times where I feel like I have confidence to explain how they work. This is the end of today's very long episode, which I suppose you could call a lecture, but my goal, I don't know if it's my goal, but just one thing that this will do is it's going to help you to read Plato's Phaedo. I gave you a step-by-step walkthrough of the argument, and even if you disagree with me on the particulars or the pronunciations of things, you can tell me in the comments. But hopefully I have gotten you a little bit closer to reading one of the great works of Western civilization. And with that, I will see you next time.